Well, thank you again, Dr. Carr, for coming on to my YouTube channel and talking with me about this fascinating book. I really enjoyed getting into the meat and potatoes of the book, Shifting Currents: A World History of Swimming. It is indeed a world history book of swimming. Where did the idea of this book come from?
Well, thank you for having me. I'm really delighted to be here. Um, the Basically the idea came because I have a website, Quattro Study Guides, where it has short articles on sort of largely daily life topics from the ancient world and the medieval world. And one day I thought I'll write about the history of swimming or what was swimming like in antiquity. And then when I started to, usually I would start typically by reading a few articles and, see what people had to say about it. And when I went to read them, I realized that there weren't any, that nobody knew anything about it. The only people who had written about swimming in the last 100 years were like swimmers, and
Hmm.
they all knew the same like four facts about swimming. Uh, Julius Caesar was a great swimmer. Um, the Persians drowned at Salamis because they didn't know how to swim. The Byron swam the Hellespont. Like that's about it.
Right. That's the history.
So they all repeated those same facts, and then I was like, okay, those things are true, but I feel like there's more to it, and I started looking into it.
Mhm. When was the earliest piece of data that you found concerning this to really start the book off and be like, okay, this is the earliest I could find or the earliest representation of swimming?
Um, the earliest evidence of swimming in the book actually came out not long before the book came out, and I had to go back
Hmm.
and change the beginning
Oh.
to accommodate it because there's now archaeological evidence of Neanderthals swimming,
Hmm.
uh, which they got by looking at the bones of the inner ear. And they show evidence of basically swimmer's ear, of an infection of the inner
Mhm.
ear that people get from diving.
Wow.
And yeah, so that's it. And they, to accompany that, there's also evidence that they're using clamshells that haven't been exposed to the air. So
Hmm.
that is, they're diving and getting sort of the smooth clamshells up from the bottom rather than the rough ones that have been kicking around on the surface.
Mm.
So
Mm.
we know that they're swimming,
Mhm.
and that's really, I think, the earliest clear evidence that people are swimming, and it came almost at the end of writing the book.
Mm. Is swimming back uh, in that era or even 100 years ago, is it based on a lot of environmental issues in that if you grow up near water, you're going to learn to live with the water in this way, or is it something else?
Well, it's a complicated question. I would
Mhm.
say absolutely, there's very little swimming in, like, the steppes across Northern Asia, in, like, Siberia and Russia and stuff.
Mhm.
There's not a lot of water. There's, the, Living Planet guidebook for tourism has a page labeled in the section on Mongolia, they have a page labeled "Swimming in Mongolia," which is just blank. So, all right, that's
Right,
pretty funny.
right.
Right. On the other hand, the corresponding climate in the Americas is the Great Plains, right?
Mhm.
Which is also a big grassland. And we know that in the Great Plains, there was actually a lot of swimming. The Mandan who lived along the shores of along the banks of the Missouri River in
Mhm.
what's now the Dakotas.
Mhm.
We have paintings from the 19th century showing them swimming, descriptions of them swimming. So absolutely, in the northern Mississippi, in the Missouri River, which is pretty much all northern, um, there's definitely people swimming,
Mm.
and in the Great Lakes,
Mhm.
also widespread swimming. So I'm inclined to think that it's not so much living in a dry area that makes you not swim as living in a cold area.
Mm.
that
Mhm.
in places where it doesn't really get warm enough to be attractive, people are
Right.
less likely to swim.
Right. I guess that's why it's called a polar plunge and not a polar swim. You get in the
Yeah,
water for a
'cause
little bit and you're like, "Okay, that's enough."
yeah, I mean, even the British wild swimmers are like they're super enthusiastic, but they're like mostly we get in and like we paddle around for a few minutes and then we get out. And then we have hot chocolate and we have tea and we have cookies and like we have a whole social scene out of the water.
Right. 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 Yeah, yeah, absolutely. When we talk about that kind of a cold climate, we have to think about the ice age or even the little ice age. When we have those kind of cold periods in world history, does that change how people interact with the water?
Absolutely. It looks as though the last big ice age was the first time that people had the sort of technological ability to stay in the north where it was cold and not just move further south. And
Mhm.
those people, they had, fur clothing and they could make fires and they could build, warmer houses and stuff like that. And the people who stayed in the north during the last ice age seem to have forgotten how to swim, like
Hmm.
as a group
Right.
across basically all of Europe and all of northern Asia, what's now Russia,
Mhm.
uh, and Mongolia and Korea. They just seem to have completely forgotten how to swim
Mm.
uh, during the last ice age. And then as they emerged from the last ice age, they were very surprised to run into people who were good swimmers further south
Mhm.
and kind of shocked.
Mhm. Mhm. Do we see this history of swimming before your book? Do we see a lot of this history of swimming through that kind of Eurocentric viewpoint of swimming itself, or were there other people talking about it that just we didn't pay much attention to it, or it just wasn't really written about a lot?
There's a whole Japanese tradition of thinking about swimming and writing about swimming that we, as European descended people, don't tend to know a lot about. That
Mhm.
was super interesting to read because this is a more political reason for swimming, but in the late Middle Ages, in the 1200s, 1300s, the Mongols under like Kublai Khan were
Mhm.
trying to conquer Japan. They had already conquered China and they got a big fleet together and they went to conquer Japan, but they didn't manage it. The fleet was destroyed by a big storm.
Mm.
I think they even tried twice, both times without managing it. And so the Japanese were like, we are way superior. We're free, unlike the enslaved Chinese. And the Mongols they were from this area that's now like Siberia, Mongolia, where people didn't swim. So the Japanese were like, we're going to become really great swimmers just to show how totally free and not conquered by the Mongols we are.
Mm.
And they did. They started having swimming competitions and they built swimming pools and they developed like a whole science of different swimming strokes. And they had this whole story about how they were really great swimmers. And then you see it in the early Olympic Games that the Japanese swimmers are winning all kinds of medals
Hmm.
in
Hmm.
the very first new Olympic Games.
Right. That was that point in the book was an area where I really started to see this kind of elitism start to pick up, where you're saying that our society, our culture, our race, even is better than these others because we know how to do this or we can do it better. Uh, that is not a new thing in our world, and I really appreciate that because like we said previously, history rhymes, and it seems like this is a rhyme that we see repeating often.
Yeah, it is. I mean, the association between knowing how to swim and being sophisticated and being upper class goes back to the Bronze Age.
Mhm.
But it takes a lot of little twists on the way to now. So, it's not just this one thing that swimming is, if you can swim, you're better than people who can't swim. There have also been periods in human history where Europeans and European descended people were like, if you can swim, it makes you an animal. It make like
Mm.
dogs can swim, horses can swim. So if you can swim, it's like you were a dog or a horse or a witch,
Hmm.
right? Maybe you have supernatural demons helping you. That's why you can swim.
Mhm. Mhm.
So it can go in a lot of different directions.
Mhm. That was something that in the book that really caught my attention as well, is that there's this constant ebb and flow with uh, what is seen as uh, more of a clean life with water in your existence, surrounding the mythology behind the water itself, putting yourself into the water, and then seeing other people's who you associate with dogs and animals. It seems like it's a constant ebb and flow, no pun intended, of how the history of swimming changes over time, or at least our conception of swimming changes over time.
Yeah, I mean, there's an early period where the non-swimmers from the ice age are just kind of emerging, and like I said, seeing these people who know how to swim, who are really good swimmers in Egypt, in India, in southern China, and they react by going, well, first they're like, that is weird. Like, I
Mhm.
wouldn't, I don't understand that. It's probably, they make up a bunch of reasons why they don't swim and these people that do. They're like, it's probably dangerous. It seems like it would be dangerous. That's probably why we don't swim, because we're like safety conscious, not like those people.
Mhm.
And also, it's just something other people do that, like, we don't culturally, it's not, part of our tradition. And also they get big on modesty. I don't swim because I don't like to, take off my clothes in public.
Mhm.
Um, and they have this whole thing about how it's displeasing to the gods when the water is disturbed. Like, the gods like a nice smooth surface on the water, and they don't like, splashing.
Hmm.
And which is very much still with us today. I mean, when you know that and you start looking for it, there are people all over European swimming being like, I like to just glide. Like, I think splashing is wrong. You
Mhm.
actually see it all the time once you
Mhm.
start looking.
Mhm.
Or the idea that if you get in the water, like, it might be dirty or you might make it dirty. A few years ago in Portland, they caught a guy peeing into the water reservoir, which is in a park in downtown Portland. And the water safety people were like the experts were like, it's really not a big deal. I mean, he should be stopped, but like, basically it's a lot of water and like a really small amount of
Mhm.
pee.
Right.
And and they pointed out that like rabbits and ducks and stuff pee in the water all the time, and like, not a big problem.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, we drained the entire reservoir, threw out all that water, and refilled it, rather than have people were so grossed out by the idea that someone had peed in the reservoir.
Yeah.
And I think that feeling descends from this old excuse for not swimming, that the gods don't like it when you dirty the water.
Mm.
So that's kind of the first stage of how Northerners, like our ancestors, your and my ancestors, experienced the water.
Mhm. Mhm.
And then um, they start to think, well, actually, these people, like the ancient Egyptians who are swimming, are actually like, they're very sophisticated, rich people. Like, they're building stone temples, and they're making big sculptures, and they're building the pyramids, and like, maybe actually we want to be like them. And so they begin to learn to swim. But there are Europeans and Northern Asians are always like dubious. They're like, they'll swim, but they're not as enthusiastic about it as people further south.
Mm.
And then when the slave trade starts in the Renaissance in like the 1400s, they turn it all around and they're like, well, we're enslaving these Africans and they are really good swimmers. There are tons of reports from early European slave dealers about how wonderful swimmers West Africans are, East Africans. There's a hysterical story where Vasco da Gama, when he's exploring, he's trying to get to India by boat, and he's gotten as far as Mozambique in East Africa. And he captures a sea captain, like a Mozambican sea captain, who's going to pilot him so that, he knows where to go.
Mm-hmm.
And then he's like mean to him. He whips him. He like threatens him. And eventually the guy like just doesn't like it. And, he doesn't want to be there anymore. And he just dives off the boat and swims away.
Yeah.
And Vasco da Gama is like, he had
How
no
to do
idea
that?
that was possible.
How do you do that? Yeah.
But what they start doing is saying that this ability to swim, these really good swimmers that they're meeting in Africa, that shows that they're like animals, not sophisticated, not rich, but like dogs, they should be enslaved. Like dogs can swim and Africans can swim. And so it shows that Africans should be enslaved, which is a total turnaround from what they had been saying 1,000 years earlier.
No, that's amazing, because it really showcased how just in a couple generations, these ideas can change 180 degrees. I mean, the little ice age changed things in a couple generations. This changed ideas in just a couple generations, but it changes to suit the needs of the time, right? And the ideas of the time.
Exactly. These guys are slave dealers. Their job is to, their business is to take free Africans and make them into captives who they're going to sell. Mm-hmm. And whatever excuses they can find, anything that makes Africans different from Europeans is helpful to them. So they start emphasizing skin color, which had not been a big deal before that. And they start emphasizing, oh, they know how to swim, and that shows that they should be enslaved.
Do they connect the idea of swimming with those that they are enslaving with physical strength yet? Because we understand now that there's a health component behind swimming, and some people think of it that for heart health, for muscular health. Have they connected that yet, or is that later on, saying that this person would be a good person to enslave because they're strong, because they swim? Or is that something that comes along later?
They actually enslave them specifically because they can swim, not just because they're strong, but because swimming is actually a super useful skill, as they're first settling the Carolinas and Georgia. They want people who can swim. When you see that it advertised in the slave auctions, so-and-so is from an area that produces very strong swimmers, and he is a very strong swimmer, or she is a very strong swimmer. They want people who can swim because they need people, for example, to dive to the bottom of the river and clear out the stumps so that boats will be able to navigate on the river, or to dig canals and that kind of thing. I mean, there's actually a ton of evidence that early slaveholders in the Americas really wanted swimmers.
So there's almost a disconnect between the enslavers and the water. They'll send someone else into the water to do it.
Oh yeah, they don't know how to swim. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I never thought about that before until I started reading through your monograph, because it's just something that we don't discuss a lot about. We don't go into this subject, which is why I appreciate it. It's a little bit of I don't want to say an eccentric topic to talk about, because everything has a history. Swimming has a history, and riding a bicycle has a history. Swimming has a history. Whatever else you can think of has a history. Yeah. I can't ride a bike either anymore. I've tried and run into a couple things.
What? They say you never forget.
They say never forget, but apparently I forget how to turn. I kind of fall over a little bit, but I don't know how to swim, which gets back to what we discussed offline, which was my European ancestors probably didn't know how to swim either.
Mhm.
And then one of my ancestors becomes an enslaver in North Carolina. Possibly they're looking for someone who can do the work around the water because they can't swim themselves. So it's a really interesting dynamic to think about, that this is in the bill of sale or in the advertisement for these folks as well.
It absolutely is. The people are, "Oh, guaranteed this one's a really good swimmer." And, that
Mhm.
that absolutely comes up. But then you can see that enslavers would be even less likely to learn how to swim, the more they associate it with being something that's a skill of,
Mhm.
enslaved Africans, that
Mhm.
they're gonna avoid it.
Mhm.
They don't wanna learn.
In America, at least, when does that idea start to turn, Dr. Carr, where we start to see people saying, okay, especially in the post Civil War years or in the 20th century, when we start to see people saying, okay, we're going to take this for ourselves now. It's not going to be yours anymore. You can't hold on to this kind of cultural or um, this idea of what you can and can't do. We're going to make sure you can't do it, or it's going to be hard for you to do it.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There's like this big change, right? Because in the early 19th century, we're still in a world where basically Africans can swim and white people
Mhm,
can't.
mhm,
And by the time you get to like the 1950s, you have people saying that black people not only can't swim, but like are genetically unable to swim.
hmm,
Like they have their bone density is wrong, or their body fat is wrong, or something about the way their arms move is wrong. Like a lot of different reasons. All of this is completely untrue,
right.
right? There are several black people who have won Olympic gold medals in swimming, which like I haven't. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
they're definitely, uh, and we have the descriptions of the slaveholders from the 1400s being like, these African swimmers are the best swimmers I ever saw in the whole world.
Hmm,
It's clearly there's no genetic reason why black people don't swim, but they are just marginalized from the water. They're pushed out. The first segregated pools appear in South Africa in like 1898, and the idea spreads from there to Singapore and to Thailand and to the United States and to Britain, all over Europe, and everybody who isn't perfect starts to be marginalized from the water, which is not just black people, but also, increasingly there's a feeling that if you're disabled, you shouldn't go to the pool. If you're fat, you shouldn't go to the pool. If you're
mhm,
old, nobody wants to see that in the water. There's this ideal person who can go swimming and everybody else isn't really supposed to.
mm, mm.
Um, but what the way they do that transition, the way they manage, because you might think that's kind of a big shift to make in such a
Right,
short time.
right.
What they do is they start emphasizing that Europeans and the white people swim scientifically, like the Greeks and Romans, and often like in a swimming pool, so it's all clean, right, with a filtration system and those blue tiles, and um, and they have swim lessons, so they know how to scientifically do the right stroke, and they have competitions with clocks and cameras and whatnot, where they're separating it from indigenous swimming of Native Americans, of Africans, of people in Southeast Asia and Indonesia, who are all really good swimmers, but they're natural swimmers
Mm,
like
mm,
dogs, right?
mhm.
Again, with this sort of analogy to they swim like animals and we swim like scientists.
Right.
Like, we swim with our brains, but they swim like by intuition.
Mhm, mhm.
And that provides a sort of bridge where they can say it's okay to swim if you're swimming scientifically, but we don't want these natural swimmers in the water with us.
Mm. Wow.
Um,
Yeah.
which, and then as soon as they've succeeded in pushing all the natural swimmers out of the water, we forgot about that and we stopped talking about how scientific we were.
Yeah. I'm sure I'm incorrect on this, so you can correct me if that's the case. But I was really intrigued by how when this shift occurs, it's also the same time period where we have the Egyptian revival period, and the Egyptians were fantastic swimmers. The Nile is right there. They were known for swimming, and I often wondered if that kind of coincided too, because we had the discoveries in Egypt at the time by Western Europeans
Mhm.
and others, and then we have the Egyptian revival period, and it seems like there's this kind of like resurgence of everything Egyptian, and I often wondered if that's also a minor connection with that kind of thing. Of if we could be more like the Egyptians, we'd swim and we would do all this, or if that's just me reaching at something that's not there.
It's a new idea. I had not thought about that Egyptian revival period, but you're absolutely right. And certainly Greek and Roman sources that people, educated people in the 19th century would have been very familiar with, do mention that the Egyptians are very good swimmers. So absolutely that could be contributing. But I think most of it is that they want to be good swimmers like the Greeks and Romans, which
Mm,
is funny because the Greeks and Romans are probably not very good swimmers, but they're very concerned. What the Greeks and Romans figured out is that you can make swimming a way of identifying aristocrats, social people from a high social class. If you live in an area where very few people know how to swim, like Europe at that
mhm,
time, right? Uh, then only people who have access to specialized lessons and have plenty of leisure time have access to the beach or a pool will know how to swim. And it's a terrific way of identifying those people in an era before like identification cards or like diplomas or anything, because it's impossible to fake. Like it's hard to learn, takes a while to learn how to swim.
mhm.
And man, if you are like a social climber who like is trying to, what's the name of that woman who was just jailed for, pretending she was rich, when she really wasn't?
Oh yeah, I know who you're
Yeah,
talking
right.
about.
If you're
Yeah,
like her and you're
yeah,
like, "Oh no, I've always been rich. I grew up rich." Um, and then you jump in the water, you can like you're not going to be able to fake it. You're
right,
just going to drown.
right.
So if you don't know how to swim, like, let me just say that do not try this at home, right?
Yeah.
Uh, it's a major cause of drowning in this country is young men going, uh, they're at a party or something, and the other people are swimming, and they're like, I bet I could do that. No, you can't. You don't know how. You're just gonna sink and drown. Don't do it. Um,
Right, right.
so they Plato emphasizes this proverb. He says that everybody knows that an uneducated person, you say they don't know how to read or swim. Like we
Mm,
would say they don't know how to read or write,
mhm. Right.
right? But he's like, they don't know how to read or swim. What do those two things have in common that they would be associated in a proverb? It's that both of them are things that take a long time to learn and you can't fake.
Hmm.
If you don't know how to read, you're not going to suddenly know how to read because you're at a fancy party or something.
Right. An epiphany. Yeah.
Right? And
Yeah.
if you don't know how to swim, same deal. You can't fake it. On the other hand, if you wash up naked on the island of the Phaeacians like Odysseus,
Hmm.
he's like holding a bush in front of him because he's completely right.
Right.
How is he going to identify himself as an upper class person? Well, he knows how to swim,
Right.
right?
Right.
And from that, his audience can tell that he's an upper class person.
Mm. I thought when we go back that far and even further in history, I thought of some of my followers who have studied religious texts and they are into religious studies for their history majors and such. And I thought about how little swimming is talked about in the Bible, and it didn't click until your book. And I'm like, yeah, that's true. I didn't think about this.
Yeah,
And the whole story of the parting of the Red Sea took a new meaning for me because like there's
I
no
know.
way, you
That
know.
was such a revelation to me. I was
Right.
like, looking at it and looking at it, and then I was like, oh my God, if you take the story of the parting of the Red Sea, right? The Egyptians are chasing the Jews, the Hebrews, and they get to the edge of the Red Sea, and the Hebrews are like yelling at Moses, "Why did you bring us here? We're just going to die on the beach because we don't know how to swim." And God parts the waters, and the Hebrews pass over on the dry land, and then the the Egyptians go into the dry land, and then God drowns them all. But we know that story, right? But if we remember that the Hebrews come from one of these West Asian cultures that didn't know how to swim,
Right.
since the Ice Age or whatever, they hadn't known how to swim. But the Egyptians are, as we were saying, famously good swimmers. Then it's much more of a miracle. It's a much greater miracle, right? The audience listening to this story, they know that the Hebrews can't swim and the Egyptians are great swimmers. And then, wow, God makes it so the Hebrews are fine and the Egyptians all drown.
Mm-hmm.
It's like this big reversal.
Right.
And I think we don't appreciate how big it would have been to the original audiences of this story.
Yeah, it took a new meaning for me, and I grew up Lutheran, converted to Catholicism, much to my family's disdain, and then I'm just not a practicing Catholic anymore. But I've read the story many times and many things in there, and it just didn't click until I'm like, yeah, they wouldn't have known how to swim.
Right.
98% of them wouldn't have known how to swim, and then thinking about them fishing, yet not knowing how to swim.
Right,
It's
like
kind of
Jesus
it's kind of
walks
like
in the water, right?
right,
That's like
right.
a bigger miracle when you realize that none of these fishermen and their boats probably knew how to swim.
Oh, it's not a miracle that that they don't know how to swim, because I love to fish and I don't know how to swim. That's not a miracle. But
No,
Jesus
but
walking
Jesus
on water,
walking on
yeah,
the water seems
yeah,
like a bigger deal when you
yeah,
realize that this is a non-swimming
right,
culture that's afraid of the water.
right. And then he tells Peter to do the same thing, and he
Right.
does.
Oh my
So,
God. Think of the amount
so
of faith, right? If you
yeah,
don't know how to swim,
yeah. It's like, come on out here, and he's like, I can't swim. No,
right?
it's not a Mel Brooks skit waiting to happen, I'm sure.
And I
Uh,
want to emphasize that it's not like you said, it's not like 100%, right? It's not like in
right,
these cultures nobody knows how to swim,
right.
whereas in Egypt everybody knows how to swim. There's always going to be some people who hold out, right?
Hmm.
Some Egyptians who weren't interested in swimming, some Europeans who were enthusiastic swimmers, even though very few other, like Benjamin Franklin is supposed to have been a good swimmer, even though most people around him in the 1700s not only didn't know how to swim, but believed that if you could swim, it showed, probably demons were helping you or something like that.
Right.
So, it's not that, but then, there's always people like Benjamin Franklin who are like, well, I just want to know how to swim.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, exactly. It's a minefield when you make the generalization. So we can't say 100% of people didn't do it, but
Right.
it's not prevalent
Right.
in those
It's
societies.
not something that everybody does all the time, and
Right.
that's something I always try to explain, that in places where swimming was really, really a big part of the culture, in West Africa, in Mozambique, in Indonesia, in the Central America, swimming is what people do for fun. Like, instead of going out dancing, or maybe in addition to going out dancing, but like, you know, instead of playing soccer, or sitting around watching television or whatever it
Mhm.
is that people do for fun,
Right.
like these are people who are swimming 2-3 times a day. Like whenever they have some spare time, they're down at the water swimming. And if you didn't swim, you would be really marginalized from society. You would be like, you know, unable to participate at any age with what people were doing. It's not just young people, it's not just sports oriented people. It's like moms with little babies and old people. Everybody's down there at the water swimming.
Hmm. Hmm. Do we see any more shifts in the 20th century with swimming because we get the opportunity to take lessons more in the I remember that when I was a kid and stuff like that. Do we see any kind of a shift in America or North America at that time with the idea of swimming? Does it become even more divided? Is there less accessibility, more accessibility? How do we see that
Mm.
transpiring in our lifetime?
In our lifetime.
Yeah, since we
Yeah.
were young.
In
Yeah,
your lifetime.
in my life. Yeah, yeah.
Um,
I'm over 40, so it's been,
swimming has actually been declining,
okay.
partly because when the Civil Rights Act meant that the pools had to be desegregated, that you had white people had to let black people swim in public pools. A lot of places in this country just closed the public pools rather than have integrated public pools.
Mm,
They just poured them full of cement and closed the building.
mhm,
That was true all over the South and in many, many places. Or even in the North, where they kept the pools open, they neglected them and they got dirty and sort of nasty, and anybody who could help it stopped swimming there, and most people just didn't go there.
mhm,
Uh, so racism has made it more difficult to swim than it used to be. Um, Swimming pools today in this country are finding it difficult to make ends meet with free swims. I gather that they lose money whenever they hold a free swim.
mhm.
And what they make money on now is things like aquasize, where you do like aerobics in the swimming pool.
Right.
And so more and more of the time at the pool is taken up with um, physical therapy and exercise classes and lessons. They can make money by giving lessons.
Mhm,
But just opening the pool and letting people come in and swim, if they raise the prices enough to pay the expense of having a lifeguard and people cleaning the locker rooms and everything, uh, people don't want to spend that much to go swimming.
mm,
So, um, and it remains, of course, something that is still very prized among very upper class people. So people who really have a lot of resources, they have a pool in back of their house, or they have a private gym that they belong to that maintains a really nice pool. But for
mhm.
everybody else, it's returned to being a great class marker.
Right,
Right?
right.
Increasingly, what we see is that this divide between wealthy people who know how to swim and everybody else who doesn't,
Mm,
or
mhm,
who don't swim. Maybe they had a few lessons as a kid, but they don't swim as a regular part of their day.
mhm. I know growing up in the Great Valley and right inside of the Appalachian Mountains, if one of my classmates, their family had a pool, that was like significant. That was like you're upper class if you have a pool. And it was just one of those markers at that time. And but that goes back to accessibility and other strata issues that I'm sure people will read about in your book. What was one nugget of information, Dr. Carr, that you found where you were like, "This is an amazing thing to uncover. I got to find out more about this." What was the one thing where we all have it when we go to archives or something, where it's like an aha moment or a wow, I wasn't expecting that. What was something for you? Anything?
Um, what comes to mind? I don't know. It was
Okay.
more of a kind of a gradual process, most
Hmm.
of it. There's a great scene that's coming to mind in medieval Egypt in the 1300s, where they're this is a place where they have now started to not swim because they've been converted to Islam, and Islam comes out of places where swimming is not a big thing, and so they're emphasizing the modesty and not wanting to take your clothes off and go swimming. And then there's a description of a guy, an African guy, well, that is, Egyptians are Africans, but
Mhm.
a black African, probably from further south, who comes up out of the Nile suddenly in this story, and he has a fish in each hand and a fish in his mouth, and he's like this incredible swimmer, and there's a long description of what a great swimmer he is. And I was like, wow, that really kind of illustrates how how strange it could seem if someone from Sudan or Chad or something came to Egypt and was a really good swimmer. I don't know if I believe that he came up with a fish in each hand and one in his mouth, but
Right.
that's the story.
I'll believe the fish in each hand. Maybe not the one in the mouth though, but well, it's one of those things.
But I've caught fish in my hands, right? In
Right.
a stream.
Yeah.
Right? You bend down and like, woof, you've got a fish in your hand.
Right. Yeah, I'll believe that one. Yeah, the one in the mouth though, I don't know so much about. But hey, it's a good story, and it got a lot of people's attention, I'm sure, and curiosity as well. No, but the book is fascinating, and the stuff that we touched on, we can only touch on so much in 40, 45 minutes. But the things that we didn't touch on, which would be like the flotation devices and clothing and all kinds of stuff, is really.
And the witches.
Pardon?
There's a whole section on floating witches. Too, right?
Yeah. We didn't even get into that. That's a whole other video right there. It's fascinating. It's really a great showing of, we can talk about the history of so many things that we take for granted, or we don't see it the way we would have seen it 50, 100, 150 years ago, and how our mindsets have changed. So Shifting Currents is a book that I really enjoyed, Dr. Carr, and I really appreciate you coming on here and talking with me on my channel, and I look forward to seeing what's next, if there's anything next.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Can I talk for a second?
Yeah, absolutely. What is next?
I just finished the first complete draft of my next book, although it's like 4 times as long as I want it to be. So there's some work ahead of me still.
Right.
But the next book it's under contract to the University of Liverpool Press, and it's about I call it Women, Clothing, and Money, and it's about the history of money and the history of gender and how those two things interact with each other. How a lot of early money in the form of like cowrie shells and beads and textiles is made or gathered by women. And then when Europeans shift to silver money, to coins, what that does to the way we see gender. And how that continues to affect the way we see both gender and money today.
Wow. That sounds interesting. I want to read that one too.
I'm super excited about it.
Yeah, I got to get all your books on my shelf here. Thank you again, Dr. Carr. I really appreciate your time. And to everyone who is watching, please check below for the link for this book. And you're going to see Dr. Carr coming out with another one, hopefully in the near future. But
yeah,
we'll be patiently waiting. Thank you, Dr. Carr.
Thank you for having me.